Okay, so it's finally time to get to the casting impressions videos of both the Gravity G5 and the G7 from ARK Fishing. Now I decided to do things a little bit different, as I'm going to separate the video for each reel. But with the G7, instead of the usual monofilament that I do my usual testing with, I am going to be using braid. So let us begin. Okay, so first up, I guess we're going to do the retesting of the G5. Now previously when I took this reel out, it was before I was informed of the rotor issue, and while I was casting it around before I fixed the rotor, I was just barely getting adequate braking with the brakes turned up to, I guess, their maximum position at the time, which I thought was the number 3 setting, and the brake dial turned up to max. And what I mean by that is that when I was casting this typical 1/2 ounce topwater, I was getting a little bit of overrun in the middle of the cast, but fortunately the casts were long enough to where it would sort itself out, and I couldn't go down any lower on the brakes without blowing the spool up. So now that we fixed the rotor, let me show you what the G5 can do. Now internally the rotor is set to the number 3 position. I got the brakes actually dialed down to their minimum setting externally. Spool tension is set to just minimize side-to-side play. And let's start casting. Okay, so I just kind of lobbed it out there with the overhead cast, and the spool was perfectly controlled. Still very free casting. Now we do got some wind going from my right to my left, so it is going to carry this top water on some of these casts, but on maximum braking, we're looking at plenty of brake power. Oh, okay. Had a slight overrun there. I think that was my fault. I kind of snapped my wrist a little too much. But we're probably getting about 35 yards on these casts. Okay, just a nice sidearm cast. Now the reel is solid. It's not making any kind of clackety noises while I'm retrieving. The casts are very smooth and free feeling. Okay, had a little bit of overrun there. I think that was because the lure was tumbling, but the G5 is solid. This feels like a mainstream offering for sure. The retrieve is still glassy smooth. Reminds me very much of a LEWS retrieve. Solid and glassy smooth. Smoother than any Abu Garcia that I've tested. That's for sure. So yeah, this reel, and this is a prototype, man, it feels great. All right, so off camera, I'm going to adjust the internal rotor setting to the number 2 position, and we'll see what it can do. Okay guys, so I set the rotor position to the number 2 setting internally. I went down 1 click on the external dial, which is the lowest I could go before the spool would just blow up on every cast. And let me show you what the G5 can do now. All right, you guys probably didn't see that, but there's a pretty good overrun during that cast that sorted itself out because the cast was so long. In fact, I think I'm going to turn the external dial to its maximum position and do a few more casts. Okay, so that cast probably was somewhere in the 50-yard range. Now there was some overrun, a little bit, worked itself out, and this is basically what I was experiencing the first time I took the G5 out. And that's because the number 3 rotor setting was basically the same as the number 2 rotor setting. And what it gave me was these really, really long casts, as you can see. But it gave me also quite a bit of overrun, and I couldn't really go lower on the brakes. But now that ARK told me how to fix the rotor, you can definitely see the difference in spool control as well as the distance. I'm thinking we're getting at least an extra 3 to 5 yards of casting distance on this same lure. That's about 10 to 15 feet. All right, so wow, the overrun is no longer there. I guess the lure is not tumbling through the air. But I can definitely see the difference between the longest cast between the number 3 and the number 2 rotor setting. All right, we'll do one more, and I'm gonna see if we can do anything in the number 1 rotor setting. Okay, so overrun there. Now I'm sure if I ran a tighter spool tension, I might be able to go lower on the brakes, but I'm thinking it's casting long enough. Okay guys, so the rotor has been set to the number 1 position, which gives us, I guess, the weakest braking. And let me show you what happens when I try to cast in the maximum external dial setting. Okay, that was just a nice easy lob cast, not really putting much into it, and if I didn't stop the spool with my thumb, that probably would have blown it up so bad that I couldn't pick the backlash out. So definitely number 1 brake setting is for, I guess, really heavy lures with extreme aerodynamic properties that'll cut through the wind, and also probably a generous backwind. Or I don't think you'd be able to use the number 1 setting for any kind of regular lures or regular type of bass fishing. Now, if you have a lot of thumb control, really skilled with your thumbing, you might be able to use it to get some extremely long casts. And let's see if I have such thumb control. I guess I don't. You would literally have to have your thumb putting a decent amount of pressure on the spool from the beginning to the end of the cast to even have a hope of getting a clean cast off in the number 1 rotor setting. Now, I'm sure with a few casts I can do it, but I don't want to burn my thumb up just trying to test that theory out. So let's see what this G5 can do with some light lures. Okay, so to test the light lure ability of the G5, we're using a Rapala Ultralight Minnow number 4, and on the scale this weighs about 3.3 grams. We got no snap swivels, so you're looking at well into upper end bait finesse territory. And keep in mind, this is just a medium powered rod with either 10 or 12 pound line. The brakes are set to internally the rotor on 3, and externally have it on maximum, and we're going to try to dial it down a little bit. But let me show you what this G5 can do finesse wise. Boom. I don't know if you guys can see where that landed. I'll do a few more. Having a little bit of overrun on the spool, but we're getting out there. It looks to be at least 25 yards or 75 foot. And this is just with, you know, my normal mostly elbow and wrist bait finesse flick. So just imagine what it could do with a true BFS rod, something in the light to ultralight power, and 4 to 6 pound line. Okay, so the spool blew up there for some reason. It's probably because this reel, as with most reels, especially magnetic breakwinds, it likes nice smooth cast strokes. No super violent wrist snapping like I can get away with let's say some centrifugal brake reels. But yeah, this reel has a huge casting range, which should be no surprise given its very, very lightweight spool. But that is definitely doable for bait finesse. All right, guys, Gravity G5, $179, $10 cheaper than the Curado K, but in my opinion, its casting range is greater than the Curado K due to the Curado K's suffering with lighter lures. And the thing about these casts is that they're going straight. They're not going off to the left. Right, they're going exactly where I'm aiming. Let's try overhead. All right. Didn't go quite as far, that was my fault. This is not the lightest combo to do one-handed overhead casts. So let's try two-handed. All right, so I had a blow up there, I guess because the spool speed was too fast, or maybe my cast stroke wasn't that smooth. But that doesn't detract the fact that this G5 is definitely handling this 3.3 gram lure without breaking a sweat. Now that's something that the Curado 200K, I definitely cannot say about that reel. It struggles with heavier bait finesse lures, especially with the accuracy part. I remember casting a 3.7 gram ultralight minnow, and that lure was going off to the left by quite a bit, but not with this G5. Okay, so we're done with the G5. Let's get to the G7.